It is the 19th of December, 1944, in a cold, grim room in the French city of Verdun, and the most senior American commanders in Europe have gathered in something very close to a crisis. 3 days earlier, the German army did the one thing almost no one believed it could still do. It launched a massive surprise offensive that has torn a huge hole in the American lines and is driving deep toward the west, threatening to split the Allied armies in two. The mood in the room is heavy, and the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, puts a question to his generals. How fast can anyone counterattack into the side of this German drive and start to turn it around? And one general answers with a promise so bold that the other men in the room can hardly believe they have heard it correctly. He says he can do it in a couple of days. He says he will take 3 divisions of his army, wheel them completely around, and attack north into the flank of the German offensive within roughly 2 days. In winter, in the snow, with an army that is at that moment facing an entirely different direction, locked in an entirely different battle, dozens of miles away. The room is skeptical, and some of the generals present clearly think the promise is bravado, that turning a whole field army 90 degrees, pulling it out of one fight, and hurling it into another across icy roads in the dead of winter, simply cannot be done that fast. It goes against everything they know about how armies move. But the general making the promise is George Patton, and what almost no one in that room understands is that he is not bluffing, and he is not dreaming. He has already done the invisible work that makes the impossible possible. And in the 4 days that follow, he is going to pull off one of the most astonishing feats of generalship in the entire Second World War. A feat that will help save an entire American division surrounded and freezing to death in a town called Bastogne, and help break the last great German offensive of the war. If you are new here, stick around, because this is Patton at the very peak of his powers, the story of how a man made a promise that sounded like madness and then kept it, and of the hidden preparation and sheer driving will that made it possible. But to understand the promise and the 4 days, you first have to understand the catastrophe that had just fallen on the American army in the Ardennes and the desperate situation of the men trapped at Bastogne. So let us go back to the surprise that started it all. By December of 1944, most people on the Allied side believed the German army in the West was beaten. It had been driven out of France, hammered back toward its own borders, and pushed onto the defensive everywhere. The general feeling was that the war might be over in a matter of months, that Germany no longer had the strength to do anything but defend, and that belief was exactly the weakness that the German command decided to exploit. In total secrecy, Germany gathered a huge force, powerful armored formations, including elite tank armies, hundreds of thousands of men, and prepared to throw them into a last desperate gamble, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the rugged, forested, hilly region straddling the border area of Belgium and Luxembourg. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. The Germans meant to smash through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, drive all the way to the vital port of Antwerp, and in doing so, split the American and British armies apart, cutting off and perhaps destroying a huge portion of the Allied force. It was Germany's bid to reverse the entire course of the war in the West in one stroke. On the 16th of December, 1944, the blow fell. The Germans attacked out of the Ardennes in force, and they achieved almost complete surprise. The American units holding that stretch of the front were thin. The Ardennes had been considered a quiet sector, a place to rest tired divisions and season green ones, and they were hit by a tidal wave of German armor and infantry. Making it worse, the weather was atrocious. Low clouds, fog, and snow that grounded the overwhelming Allied air forces, taking away one of the Americans' greatest advantages and letting the German columns move without being bombed from the sky. The German drive punched deep into the American lines, creating an enormous westward bulge in the front, which is why the battle would come to be known, forever after, as the Battle of the Bulge. In those first days, it was a genuine crisis. The line had been broken. German tanks were pouring west, and the whole Allied command had to scramble to contain a disaster that no one had seen coming. The scale of the thing was staggering, and so was the audacity. The Germans had assembled 2 powerful armored armies and more, spearheaded by their best remaining tank formations, and they threw them into a relatively narrow stretch of front, held by a handful of tired or inexperienced American divisions. In the opening days, the sheer weight and surprise of the blow overwhelmed the defenders in many places. Some American units were surrounded and forced to surrender. Others fought desperate, delaying actions from village to village, buying time with their lives. The German spearheads raced westward, and behind the front there was, for a few days, something close to panic as the command struggled to understand how big the attack was and where it was heading. It was, by any measure, the greatest crisis the American army faced in the entire war in Europe, a moment when the confident assumption that Germany was finished was shattered overnight, and the outcome genuinely hung in the balance. This was not a minor spoiling attack. It was Germany's last great throw of the dice, and in the first days it looked frighteningly like it might work. And in the middle of that chaos, one small Belgian town suddenly became one of the most important pieces of ground in the entire war. Its name was Bastogne. Bastogne was not much to look at, a modest town in the Ardennes, but it had one feature that made it absolutely vital. It was a road hub. 7 roads converged at Bastogne, radiating out in all directions like the spokes of a wheel. And in the rugged, wooded, snow-choked terrain of the Ardennes, where movement off the roads was difficult and slow, whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the flow of an army through the whole region. The German offensive needed those roads. To keep their drive moving west, to supply their spearheads, the Germans had to have Bastogne, and so both sides understood very quickly that Bastogne had to be held at all costs by the Americans and taken at all costs by the Germans. The Americans won the race to get there, barely. As the crisis exploded, the American command rushed reinforcements toward Bastogne, and the unit that would make the town immortal was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, along with supporting armor and other units. These paratroopers, pulled hastily from rest, were trucked to Bastogne and dug in around the town just as the Germans arrived. And then the ring closed. The German advance flowed around Bastogne on both sides and met beyond it, cutting the town off completely. The 101st Airborne and the men fighting alongside them were surrounded, encircled, isolated, an island of American resistance deep inside German-held territory, with the enemy on every side. The way the defenders got there at all is a small drama of its own. The paratroopers of the 101st had been pulled back from the front for rest and refitting after months of hard campaigning, scattered in camps well behind the lines, many of their men on leave, short of equipment and winter gear. When the German offensive exploded and the command grasped how vital Bastogne was, these men were roused, thrown onto trucks, and rushed toward the town in a frantic road march, some of them arriving still short of ammunition and cold weather clothing, scrounging what they could as they went. They reached Bastogne and fanned out to dig in around it in the nick of time, taking up positions in the frozen woods and fields, ringing the town just as the leading German units came probing in. Alongside them fought armored troops and other units who had also been fed into the defense, all of them now welded together into the garrison of Bastogne. It was a close-run thing. Had the paratroopers arrived a day later, or had the Germans pushed a little harder or faster at the crossroads, the town might have fallen before the defense could be organized at all. Instead, the Screaming Eagles and their comrades got there first and dug in, and then held on as the enemy swept around them and sealed them off from the rest of the American army. The conditions inside the encircled town were brutal. It was one of the coldest winters in memory, and the defenders were freezing, many of them without proper winter clothing, dug into frozen foxholes in the snow. They were running critically low on everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies. Their wounded could not be evacuated and could barely be treated. And the fog and snow that had helped the Germans achieve surprise now did something even crueler. It prevented Allied aircraft from flying in supplies to the trapped defenders. So there they sat, cut off, cold, hungry, low on bullets, their wounded suffering, surrounded by a much larger enemy force, holding a ring around a vital town by sheer stubborn courage. And it was into this situation that the Germans, on the 22nd of December, sent one of the most famous demands in military history. Confident that the surrounded Americans must see the hopelessness of their position, the German commanders sent an ultimatum into Bastogne under a flag of truce, demanding that the Americans surrender the town to avoid annihilation. The demand was carried to the acting commander of the defense, an American general named Anthony McAuliffe, and McAuliffe's response has echoed down the decades as the perfect distillation of American defiance. His official written reply to the German surrender demand consisted of a single word: nuts. The Germans who received it were genuinely baffled. It did not translate, and they had to have it explained to them that this piece of American slang meant, in effect, go to hell. The message could not have been clearer. The surrounded, freezing, outnumbered defenders of Bastogne were not surrendering anything. They would hold. But holding on its own could only last so long. Without relief, the ring would eventually tighten and crush them. Someone had to break through from the outside and reach them. And that someone was going to be Patton. There is a detail about that famous reply that captures the whole spirit of the Bastogne defense. When the German delegation came forward under their white flag and delivered their surrender ultimatum, a formal, courteous document warning of annihilation and offering honorable terms, it was carried to the American commander, and the story goes that his first spontaneous reaction to being told the Germans wanted him to surrender was simply that single, disgusted, incredulous word. When his staff pointed out that he needed to send some kind of official reply, he decided he could not improve on his first reaction, and so that one word became the formal written answer handed back to the waiting Germans. And the beauty of it is that it left the enemy genuinely confused. The German officers, reading this one strange piece of American slang, could not work out what it meant. Was it a yes, a no, some code? It had to be explained to them in plain terms that the answer was an emphatic and contemptuous refusal, that it meant something along the lines of, go to hell. The defenders of Bastogne, cut off and outnumbered and freezing, had answered a demand for their surrender, not with a long defiant speech, but with a single word of pure, dismissive scorn. It became one of the most beloved moments in American military history precisely because it was so perfectly, stubbornly, unbreakably defiant. These men were not going anywhere, and they had said so in a single unforgettable word. Which brings us back to that cold room in Verdun and to the promise. When Eisenhower gathered his commanders on the 19th of December to figure out how to respond to the German offensive, the key question was how quickly a powerful counterattack could be launched into the flank of the German Bulge, and in particular, how quickly someone could drive north to relieve the pressure and reach the surrounded forces. Patton's Third Army was positioned to the south, but it was facing the wrong way. It was oriented eastward, deep in its own offensive operations toward the German border in a completely different direction. To send it north into the flank of the Bulge, Patton would have to do something that the textbook said takes a long time and enormous effort: disengage a large army from an active battle, turn it 90 degrees, and send it attacking on a new axis, all in winter, over bad roads, in terrible weather. When Eisenhower asked how fast it could be done, the expectation in the room was that it would take many days, perhaps a week or more, to get a serious attack going. Patton said 2 days. He said he could launch a 3-division attack to the north within roughly 48 hours. You have to picture the room to feel the weight of that moment. The atmosphere at Verdun was tense and grim. The German offensive was still driving forward. The situation was still dangerous, and the assembled commanders were wrestling with a genuine crisis. Eisenhower, steadying the room, made clear he wanted to treat this not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity. The Germans had come out from behind their defenses into the open, and if the Allies could react fast enough, they could cut off and destroy them. But everyone understood that reacting fast enough was the whole problem. And when Patton made his claim, the reaction was open skepticism. By the accounts of that meeting, there was a moment of near disbelief. Some present thought he was overpromising to look bold. The idea that any commander could take a field army that was actively attacking in one direction, break it off, turn it a quarter circle, and have it attacking hard in a completely different direction within 2 days ran against the collected professional experience of every senior officer in the room. Armies are enormous, ponderous things. They do not turn on a coin. To promise it in winter over the worst roads and in the worst weather sounded to many like bravado dressed up as a plan. Eisenhower himself, according to the story, gently pushed back, warning Patton not to be flippant about so serious a matter. And Patton insisted he was completely serious. He was, because he knew something the rest of the room did not. And the reason he could say it, the reason it was not empty boasting, is the part of this story that reveals Patton's real genius, the genius that lay underneath all the pistols and the profanity and the bluster. Patton had seen this coming. In the days before the Verdun meeting, as the shape of the German offensive became clear, Patton and his staff had already begun quietly working out exactly what the Third Army would do if it were ordered to break off its current attack and drive north. He had his staff prepare not just one plan, but several different possible plans for a rapid turn and attack in the new direction, so that whatever Eisenhower decided, the Third Army would already have a worked-out scheme ready to execute. He had even arranged a simple code system with his staff, so that when the decision came, he could set the whole enormous machine in motion with a single, short phone call. So when Eisenhower asked the question in that room, Patton was not making a wild guess. He was describing a plan that already existed, that his staff was already preparing, that could be triggered in an instant. The audacity that stunned the room was real, but it was audacity built on top of foresight and preparation that no one else in the room could see. That is the whole secret of the moment. Patton could promise the impossible because he had already done the invisible work that made it possible. He made his phone call, and then he did the thing that even his admirers found hard to believe. Turning a field army 90 degrees in the middle of winter is not a matter of simply telling men to march in a new direction. It is one of the most complicated things an army can attempt. It means untangling hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles from an ongoing battle, reversing supply lines that run one way and making them run another, rerouting fuel and ammunition and food, controlling traffic on narrow, icy, snow-clogged roads so that the whole force does not collapse into a frozen jam, and doing all of it fast enough to matter, while the enemy is not waiting politely for you to finish. It is the kind of feat that armies train for and still fail at. Patton's Third Army did it in a matter of days. His staff work, honed by exactly the preparation he had ordered in advance, held the plan together. His soldiers pulled out of one fight, climbed onto their vehicles, and drove north through freezing weather over treacherous roads. Traffic was marshaled, columns were pushed forward, and an enormous portion of an entire army pivoted and began driving toward the sound of the guns at Bastogne. Commanders who had thought the timetable impossible watched it happen. It remains to this day one of the most impressive demonstrations of large-scale military movement and command in the history of the American Army. The sheer physical and organizational achievement of wheeling that much combat power around in that little time, in those conditions. Consider just a few of the things that had to go right, all at once, for that pivot to work. Fighting units already locked in combat to the east had to be pulled out of contact with the enemy without the whole line collapsing behind them. New units had to be slotted in to hold the ground they left. The vast river of supply that feeds an army, the fuel above all, without which not a single tank moves, and the ammunition and the food and the countless other necessities had to be redirected onto new roads leading in a new direction, on almost no notice. Traffic on the narrow, iced, snow-packed roads of the region had to be controlled with iron discipline because a single jam of stalled vehicles on a crucial route could freeze an entire division in place for hours it did not have. Orders had to reach thousands of subordinate units and be understood and be acted on fast. Any one of these tasks, done poorly, could have wrecked the timetable. The Third Army did all of them at once, in the cold and the dark, and kept the columns rolling north. It was not glamorous work. It was the unseen craft of staff officers and traffic controllers and supply men and truck drivers and exhausted soldiers, the machinery beneath the drama, and it performed under pressure exactly as Patton had built it to. The bold promise in the room at Verdun would have meant nothing if this vast, grinding, unglamorous labor had failed. It did not fail. There is one more piece of the story that Patton himself considered important, and it has become one of the most talked about episodes of the whole campaign. The weather, remember, was the great enemy. the fog and snow that grounded the Allied air forces and kept supplies from reaching Bastogne. Patton, who was a genuinely and unusually religious man beneath the hard exterior, wanted that weather changed, and he approached the problem the way he approached everything, directly. He had the chief chaplain of the Third Army compose a prayer for good weather, so that the skies would clear and the Allied air power could be brought to bear. The prayer was printed and distributed to the soldiers of the Third Army. And then, in the days that followed, the weather did clear. Around the time the relief drive was underway, the fog lifted and the skies opened, and the Allied air forces roared back into action, flying supplies into the surrounded defenders of Bastogne in great parachute drops of ammunition and food and medicine, and pounding the German columns from above. Whether one sees the hand of Providence in it or simply the ordinary turning of winter weather, the effect was enormous, and Patton never forgot it. The clearing skies gave the trapped defenders a lifeline and gave the relieving force the air support it needed. The episode of the prayer has become one of the most retold stories of the whole campaign, and it is worth understanding why it stuck. It captures something real and slightly contradictory about Patton, a man of tremendous profanity and hardness who was also genuinely a believer, who saw no conflict between cursing at his soldiers to drive them forward and asking God to clear the skies so those same soldiers could win. When he had the chaplain compose the prayer, he was not performing piety for the cameras. By all accounts, he meant it. He wanted every advantage he could get, natural or otherwise, and to Patton, appealing for good weather was simply one more move in a campaign he intended to win by any means available. And then the skies actually did clear at the crucial moment, which turned the story from a curious anecdote into a small legend, the general who prayed for good weather and got it. The practical effect was immense and had nothing to do with legend. Once the fog lifted, the Allied air forces returned in strength, and their return changed the battle. Cargo planes streamed over Bastogne, dropping bundles of supplies by parachute to the surrounded garrison, easing the desperate shortages of ammunition and food and medicine. Fighter bombers ranged over the German columns, hammering the very forces that were trying to hold back the relief and crush the town. The weather that had shielded the German offensive from the air now turned against it. Whatever the cause, the timing could hardly have been better for the men of Bastogne and for the soldiers driving to save them. Now came the 4 days that the whole story has been building toward. The hard, grinding drive to actually break through to Bastogne. Because turning the army north was only the beginning, the Third Army's spearheads now had to fight their way through determined German resistance, in winter, over difficult ground, to reach the surrounded town. The Germans knew the relief was coming and fought hard to stop it, contesting every village and every road. The leading edge of the drive was carried by one of Patton's finest units, the 4th Armored Division, and the tankers and armored infantry at the point of the spear battled north through snow and cold and enemy fire, town by town, mile by mile, in a race against time. Because every hour that passed, the defenders of Bastogne grew weaker, and the German ring pressed harder. It was not a clean or easy advance. It was a slugging match against a stubborn enemy in miserable conditions, and the men who made it paid for every mile. Each of those 4 days had its own hard character. The Germans understood exactly what the relief drive meant, and they threw everything they could spare into stopping it, blocking the roads, defending the villages that sat astride the route north, counterattacking the flanks of the advancing columns. The 4th Armored's tankers and infantry had to take those villages one at a time, in bitter cold, often against dug-in defenders and anti-tank guns, on ground that gave every advantage to the defense. Tanks bogged in the snow and mud. Some were lost to hidden guns and mines. Men fell in the freezing fields. Progress was measured not in the sweeping advances Patton loved, but in hard, costly, incremental gains. A village cleared, a road opened, a few more miles closed toward the surrounded town. And all of it was run against a merciless clock, because everyone driving north knew that inside Bastogne, the defenders were growing weaker by the hour, running lower on everything, and that the German ring was pressing in. There was no option to slow down and do it carefully. The relief force had to be fast, and it had to be relentless, and so the men pushed on through exhaustion and cold and loss, driven by their commanders and by the simple, powerful knowledge of who was waiting for them at the end of the road. It was, in miniature, everything the whole campaign demanded: speed bought with blood against a stubborn enemy in the worst conditions the winter could offer. But they kept coming, driven forward by the knowledge that fellow Americans were surrounded and waiting, and by the relentless will of the commander behind them, who was pushing the whole drive with everything he had. And on the 26th of December, 1944, they broke through. The spearhead of the 4th Armored Division punched through the last of the German ring and made contact with the defenders of Bastogne, opening a corridor into the surrounded town. The lead tanks rolled through to link up with the men of the 101st Airborne, who had held that perimeter through days of freezing hell. The moment of contact has its own small human immortality. The very tip of the spearhead, the first American tanks to punch through the German ring from the outside, rolled up to the astonished defenders on the perimeter. And after days of encirclement, of wondering whether relief would ever come, the men of Bastogne saw friendly armor coming toward them from the direction of rescue, rather than the direction of the enemy. The lead tank commander and the paratroopers who met him exchanged a few words across that thin, hard-won corridor. The sight of American tanks breaking in from outside the ring must have been one of the most welcome things those frozen, exhausted defenders had ever seen. Behind that first contact, the corridor was widened and held open under fire, and through it, the lifeline finally flowed. Trucks bringing in ammunition and food and medical supplies, and carrying out, at last, the wounded who had been suffering for days inside the town with almost no way to treat them. The spearhead that broke through was led by some of the finest armored soldiers in the American Army, the same hard-driving tankers who had been at the point of Patton's advances before, and they had done it again, cracking a path through a determined enemy to reach their surrounded countrymen. The siege of Bastogne, after everything, was over. The siege was broken. A lifeline had been driven straight through the German encirclement, and through it now flowed everything the defenders needed: supplies in, wounded out, reinforcements forward. Bastogne, surrounded and written off by the enemy, had held, and now it had been relieved. From the promise in that room at Verdun on the 19th to the breakthrough on the 26th, and above all, in the 4 hard days of driving and fighting to reach the town, Patton had done exactly what he said he would do. He had turned his army in the dead of winter, driven it north through the enemy's flank, and broken through to the surrounded men, one of the great feats of arms of the entire war, delivered on the timetable that a room full of generals had thought impossible. Patton considered the relief of Bastogne one of the finest achievements of his career, and he was right to. It is worth being precise about what it meant. The defenders of Bastogne, the men of the 101st, and those alongside them, deserve enormous credit in their own right. They held that perimeter through days of encirclement, cold and shortage by their own courage, and there is a proud tradition that insists they did not need rescuing so much as reinforcement. There is real truth in that. They never broke. But the strategic reality is that the siege had to be lifted, the corridor had to be opened, and the pressure had to be relieved before the ring could be tightened to the breaking point. And it was Patton's drive that did it. The two things together, the stubborn defense from inside and the relentless relief from outside, turned Bastogne from a potential disaster into one of the defining American victories of the war. And Bastogne, held and relieved, was one of the great breakwaters against which the entire German offensive spent itself. The last great German gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, was broken, and the German army in the West would never mount a serious offensive again. It is worth stepping back to see how much rode on that outcome. The German offensive had been a genuine gamble, with the whole war in the West as its stake, an attempt to shatter the Allied armies and change the entire trajectory of the conflict. When it failed, it did not just fail to gain ground, it consumed the last great reserves of German armor and manpower in the West, the forces that had been carefully hoarded for this one throw. Those men and machines, spent in the snow of the Ardennes and unable to break through at the crucial points, could not be replaced. Germany had bet its remaining offensive strength on the Bulge, and it had lost the bet. In the weeks that followed, the Bulge in the line was pinched off and pushed back. The ground given up in December was retaken, and the road into Germany itself lay open to the Allied armies. Bastogne, held and relieved, had been one of the great immovable obstacles around which the whole German offensive broke apart. The crossroads the enemy needed and never got. The island of resistance that refused to be swallowed whole. And Patton's drive to relieve it stands as one of the decisive strokes of the entire campaign. The crisis that had begun with a shocking surprise in the middle of December ended within a matter of weeks, with the German army in the west broken as an offensive force for good. The men of Bastogne and the men who fought their way through to them had helped turn Germany's last great gamble into its final failure. So what do we take from Patton and the 4 days? The easy version of the story is the one about audacity. The bold general who promised the impossible and delivered it. The swaggering hero who saw a chance for glory and seized it. And the audacity was real. But if you stop there, you miss the actual lesson, which is more interesting and more useful. Patton could make that impossible promise in the room at Verdun for one reason above all others. Because he had already done the quiet, unglamorous, invisible work of preparation before anyone asked him to. He had anticipated the need. He had put his staff to work on the plans in advance. He had thought through the problem while other men were still absorbing the shock of the German attack. When the moment came, he was ready, and readiness, not bravado, is what let him keep the promise. The dramatic scene in the room, the bold pledge that stunned the generals, was only the visible tip of something built on days of foresight that no one saw. That is almost always how it works with the things that look like genius or miracle. Underneath the miracle is preparation. And there is one more thing worth noticing, because we have followed Patton into his failures as well as his triumphs on this channel. The very qualities that made Patton dangerous in other circumstances, his restless aggression, his impatience, his hunger to attack, his refusal to accept that something could not be done, were, at Bastogne, exactly the right qualities at exactly the right moment. The same relentless drive that could lead him astray when it was pointed at the wrong objective was, when pointed at a surrounded American division in the snow, precisely the thing that saved the day. A more cautious general, a more conventional general, might have taken the week that everyone expected, and a week might have been too long. Patton's whole nature was built for this one kind of moment, the crisis that rewards speed and boldness above all else. At Bastogne, the man and the moment fit perfectly. It was, in a sense, the situation he had been preparing for his entire life, and when it came, he was ready for it as almost no one else could have been. The restless energy that made him hard to command in quiet times was the very thing that made him irreplaceable in a crisis that rewarded nothing but speed. That is the Patton worth remembering. Not the caricature of the pistols and the swagger, but the commander who did his homework before the test, and who, when an army needed to do the impossible in 4 days of winter, made sure it could. The promise sounded like madness in that room at Verdun. It was, in truth, the most prepared promise a general ever made, and that is exactly why he kept it, when a room full of experts was sure he could not. Now, I want to hear from you. Had you known the full story of how Patton relieved Bastogne, not just the famous nuts reply from inside the town, but the promise at Verdun and the extraordinary pivot of an entire army in the dead of winter? Tell me in the comments which part struck you most, the surrounded defenders, the impossible promise, the hidden preparation behind it, or the 4-day drive to break through. I read everyone. If this deepened your understanding of what actually happened at Bastogne, do me the simple favor of hitting the like button. It genuinely helps carry these stories to more people who care about the real history behind the legends. And if you are not yet subscribed, you will want to be here for the next one, because we are going to tell the story of the men who made all of Patton's lightning drives possible in the first place. The truck drivers, most of them black soldiers, who ran a non-stop river of fuel and ammunition to the front through day and night, without whom Patton's tanks would have simply rolled to a stop in the mud, and who were almost never thanked for it. Subscribe, so you are here when we give them their due. Thanks for watching.